This presentation is about the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. And these areas were originally part of the Dutch. They became independent from Spain actually in 1579, so it was easy to acquire land from them. And here is a map that shows you which colonies that we are talking about. And the characteristics of the colonies include excellent land for farming. In fact, they became known as the bread colonies because of their exports of grain. There are three rivers nearby: Susquehanna, Delaware, and the Hudson, all which facilitated fur trade. These are less aristocratic, with the exception of New York, than other colonies because their land holdings are medium sized. There are fewer industries than New England, but more than in the South. The main industries were shipbuilding and lumber and commerce. They are ethnically mixed, meaning that there were more than just English and Dutch, there were also Scotch, Irish, and German, and others. They are religiously tolerant compared to many other colonies. They are also urban because they were linked by trade, and socially and economically democratic. New York. Henry Hudson was an Englishman who was employed by the Dutch East India Company, and his job was to explore and find the Northwest Passage and establish Dutch claims to the region. The Dutch at the time were a commercial and naval power. New Netherlands was established in 1623 by the Dutch West India Company for quick profit with the fur trade. The first permanent Dutch settlement was at Fort Orange, which became Albany, New York, in 1624, and Peter Minuit led part of that effort. Manhattan was bought by the Dutch from the Indians for $30, and this was a 22,000 acres. And the tribe that actually sold it, well, they didn't really own it, so that was a problem. But the Dutch attempted favorable trade relations with natives, unlike other groups. New Amsterdam, which became New York City, was founded as a company town and seaport of the Dutch West India Company. They had little religion. They had freedom of speech or democracy. They didn't have very much of that at all. They were a company town, and they were run like a business. If you look at the seal of New Amsterdam, you'll see a beaver, which tells you it's all about profit. And so there were very few settlers. The structure of New Amsterdam was patroonships, which are aristocratic. They're huge estates granted to people who would settle 50 people on them. One estate was larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, or colony of Rhode Island. After repeated protests, they became semi-representative body was granted because prior to that, there hadn't been any democracy, like I said, or religious tolerance or free speech. However, they do become, New York is going to become cosmopolitan in the 1640s. They will speak 18 different languages, be very diverse, and more than a half of the people aren't even Dutch. So New York is established in 1664, and the New York Charter of Liberties in 1683 granted freedom of religion to all Christians. All landowners were allowed to vote, and it laid out a political organization for the colony, creating counties, setting up election procedures, and granting some individual rights. These retained feudal traits like the southern plantations. Later, it became a royal colony in 1685 as part of the Dominion of New England until the Glorious Revolution. New York flourished under England, trade with the Iroquois, and it also had an aristocratic style which discouraged growth. This was an important step in eventual democracy. Leisler's rebellion in 1691. Jacob Leisler was a German immigrant. The patroonship remnants led to popular discontent. The huge estates crowded out many poor farmers, and poor whites and farmers were inspired by the Glorious Revolution and overthrew the Dominion of New England. The revolt is going to fail, and Leisler will be hanged, and the huge estates will continue. So the significance is that it shows the resentment about British policy and the English imposing their will on the colonists and that they'll rebel. A few more bits of information about New York. is that native retaliation of Dutch violence happened, and so they built a wall, which became known as Wall Street. New England saw the Dutch as a threat. You had Swedes from Sweden who were trespassing, and they established New Sweden from 1638 to 1655, and they built a fort in what will become Delaware. In 1655, the Dutch force, led by Peter Stuyvesant, ended the Swedish rule in a bloodless fight. In 1664, Charles II sent his brother James, the Duke of York, to control the area. After Stuyvesant surrendered, no shots were fired. By 1664, the English had Maine to Carolinas, which meant they had strategic rivers and harbors. This will lead to conflict with the French. New York was aristocratic, had a mixed economy, and still have some Dutch names such as Harlem and Brooklyn. So that is about New York. Moving on to talk about the Beaver Wars. New Netherlands traded with the Iroquois, and New France with the Huron and Algonquin tribes. They were mutually beneficial alliances. Goods and resources created profound change in the Native Americans, such as alcohol. The demand for furs caused the beaver to decline in Iroquois territory. Introduction of guns also depletes the beaver population. It's efficient, but they destroy the beavers. Guns intensify the rivalries between tribes. The Iroquois are aggressively expanding their hunting grounds into the Great Lakes. This will lead to competition with the French. From 1638 to 1698, there will be fighting. The Iroquois attack when the French are going to refuse to allow them to disrupt their trading relationship that they already have with the Huron. And this will pit New France and New Netherlands and the English and the Native Americans against each other. The Iroquois will bring 80 canoes of fur to the French in an attempt to have them buy it. However, the French will refuse because they're already trading with the Huron. In 1664, the Dutch will abandon New Amsterdam, and now the Iroquois will have lack of support. The English will give them weapons as a buffer against the Catholic French. In 1698, the Great Peace of Montreal, the Dutch will be gone. A large number of British settlers will become a bigger threat than France. And then in 1681, Pennsylvania will move into the traditional Iroquois land. Moving on to Pennsylvania, the Quakers are nonconformists, non-hierarchy. There's no clergy. They have a personal relationship with God. They refuse to pay taxes for the Anglican Church. There is no central authority figure. They are pacifists, meaning that they refuse to fight in the military, and they denounce war. They sought religious and civic freedom. They were simple and democratic. All men are equal. There is no scripture, and they are going to acquire East Jersey in 1680. They're also known as the Religious Society of Friends. The Quakers will be okay. William Penn in 1681 gains a huge grant from the king in return for money owed to his father, and it becomes known as Penn's Woods. And Penn likes Quakerism. He doesn't see a need to establish a church. He likes the idea of the personal relationship with God. So his primary motive for founding the colony is to make it a haven for Quakers. His secondary motive is to experiment with liberal ideas of government while making a profit at the same time. There will be a representative assembly elected by the landowners. So this is known as the Holy Experiment because there is also religious tolerance among the many denominations. Pennsylvania will become the best advertised of all colonies. Pamphlets will be distributed in England, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. It will become a promised land, freedom of religion, and representative government. There are generous land policies that will attract many immigrants. It will also attract carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and many other manual workers. It will grow rapidly with no restrictions on immigration, and by 1700, it is the third largest colony, with only Massachusetts and Virginia being larger. There will be Swedes, Finns, and Dutch that in the area that are going to be naturalized members of the colony. They will recognize the authority of the king, but create local governments. One of them, known as the Charter of Privileges in 1701. Philadelphia was a carefully planned community. Penn actually bought the land from the Indians, and the Quakers had an excellent relationship with them. The representative government established with landowners having voting rights. Again, there was no tax supported state church. Freedom of worship was guaranteed of all residents. There was no provision for military defense because, again, the Quakers didn't believe in that. And the Quakers were strongly against slavery, and they were the most outspoken early on about that. In 1682, the Duke of York gave Penn Delaware, and in 1703 granted it its own assembly, where it remained under the government of Pennsylvania. By 1700, Pennsylvania again is the fourth largest colony because Maryland has now surpassed it. It's the largest in terms of German population. New Jersey started in 1664 as a Quaker settlement. It was first colonized by the Dutch in 1613, and they were attracted by land offers and religious freedom. New Jersey is going to be created as its combined two colonies together. Delaware is a large Quaker population. It will remain under the government of Pennsylvania until 1776, but it did have its own assembly. The Dutch had settled in 1631, but they were all killed by Native Americans. In 1638, the Swedes set up a colony and trading post in Fort Christina, which will become Wilmington, Delaware. In the 1651, the Dutch reclaimed it. In 1664, the British then removed the Dutch, and Penn will lease the western shore. This will anger Lord Baltimore of Maryland, and there will be 100 years of conflict, sometimes violent. In 1750, a border dispute between Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Maryland and Delaware will lead to, and their borders will end up being defined as part of the Mason-Dixon line of 1768. And that is it for the Middle Colonies.